Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Amy Barron. We are in the second program of the perinatal loss series that I am putting on with Rabbi David Balto. This is a series that we are spending time discussing specifically on the Jewish responses to perinatal loss. And as many of you know, if you were here last time, or if you're familiar with the work of I Was Supposed to Have a Baby, this work is deeply personal to me because I also had 6 miscarriages, and the emotions that I went through during that time, and frankly, in the years afterwards, and still go through on a daily basis today in the work that I do, is something that really permeates lots of different pieces of my life. And I think tonight's discussion specifically on grieving and different aspects of grieving, where Nancy and Devorah will speak to you about all of these different points, really will help you understand a little bit more about what the grieving process looks like and why it really doesn't ever end. And I'm not going to steal any of Devorah and Nancy's thunder, but I wanted to just thank all of you for being here. We've already set the stage with Cantor Labowitz and Rabbi Ilan Glazer last time, who told their personal stories. And now we're going to take a step back and give you more of the clinical end and let you hear from 2 people who are doing this work all day long. But for a moment, we're just going to pause for a second and tell you a little bit more about the conference, tell you about the people who are supporting this and why we've put this together. Rabbi Balto, please.
Thank you so much, Amy, and I'm honored to participate in this program. This is an issue that I know as a chaplain in a hospital, what a tremendous need there is, and I admire everybody who's participating in this conference, not only the speakers but the participants, knowing that how many of you have had your own personal experience and are dealing with long-term, grappling with that relationship you've had with a child who did not come into this world. Today we have just an excellent program with Devorah Enton and Nancy Burlow. You can see both of their bios, and they both, as Dr. Barron said, are on the first line dealing directly with people, and you'll learn about that. We're really lucky to be sponsored by a number of organizations. If we can go to the slightly earlier slide, and I really want to honor these people. I Was Supposed to Have the Baby, Nechama Comfort, the National Council of Jewish Women, OHEL, and Our Love Continues. These are 5 organizations which are really out there in the forefront with providing services for families that are struggling with these issues. And I strongly recommend, if you are, that you take the time to look at their websites and see the supportive services they provide. So with that, let me turn it back over to Dr. Barron.
Thank you. Tonight, as David mentioned, we have the 5 sponsoring organizations, the organizations that are doing this work on the ground. I Was Supposed to Have a Baby, the organization that I run, is one of them. But we also want to mention the supporting organizations who felt that this work was extremely important and wanted to lend their names to this. So they are the National Bikor Cholim Conference, which David, Rabbi Balto, is going to talk to you more about that as we close the program. Neshama, the Association for Jewish Chaplains, the Network for Jewish Human Service Agencies, Sviva, Plaza Jewish Community Council, Ritual Well, Kavod V'Nachum, Shomer Collective. These are all incredibly wonderful organizations that are providing auxiliary work on the ground. and we work hand in hand with so many of them, and we love the fact that they are supporting this. I also really owe a great debt of gratitude to Rabbi David Balto and his wife Naomi for financially sponsoring this conference. We really could not have done it without them. Just a quick reminder before we get started, this is being recorded. We will be sending out a recording of this specific program, and we also sent out a recording of the first program. We are going to be sending that out either tomorrow, or you'll have it by Monday. So if any of your colleagues, we've mentioned this already to them, but if any of your colleagues were not able to make it and join us live, a recording will be available. And we urge you to keep your cameras on and participate in the chat. You know, Devorah and Nancy have an interactive conversation for all of you, and we really want to hear from you and have you participate as much as possible. And with that, I'm really going to get started. So tonight's program is really about grief, and it's about the fact that time really just does not heal all wounds. We're calling this the wisdom of grieving perinatal loss. And Devorah specifically is going to be talking about the myths and the triggers that really are just portray the inaccurate reality of what perinatal loss is, specifically offering a framework, but then a different framework in terms of what grief really looks like. But what I want to do is I want to give Nancy the opportunity. I want to introduce you to Nancy Berlow. Nancy she has been working with and for the perinatal loss program as part of the National Council of Jewish Women for over 11 years. And she herself has a personal story. And I think that while we did spend we spent all of last program talking about personal stories, I think bringing Nancy here again as both someone to discuss her own personal story and also providing that commentator to Devorah as she goes through her presentation, I think it's important for her to set the stage and just remind people of what this actually looks like when you're going through it. So Nancy, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, David. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of the evening's program on perinatal loss and time does not heal all wounds. Thank you to Rabbi Balto and Amy Barron for putting this amazing conference together. Thank you to Cantor Hinda for sharing your story about losing Ronen, and to Rabbi Ilan for sharing your story about the loss of Shmariyahu. You both spoke so movingly, educating and inspiring us in this shared space. I'm going to share a little bit about myself and what brought me to this place. I lived in Israel for 12 years, met and married my husband there, and then embarked on a long journey of loss and infertility following an ectopic pregnancy when I lost one of my fallopian tubes. After 4 IVF attempts, we finally conceived our first daughter, who is now 30 years old. In Israel, we were not limited to a certain number of IVF attempts. Socialized medicine and an emphasis on having children as such allowed us to pursue many efforts. We started trying again when our daughter was 9 months old. After 6 more IVF attempts that were unsuccessful, we became frustrated, disillusioned, and honestly exhausted. For this and some other reasons, we returned to live in the US. Here, I became involved in the organization Resolve, which educates and supports individuals and couples who are going through infertility. I wrote an article way back then about the IVF loss, an under-recognized and very painful experience. I used to crawl up in a ball and sob, failed IVF after failed IVF. This disenfranchised grief, when your grief does not fit in with society's norms of dealing with loss, is the absolute epitome of where perinatal loss falls. After 2 more attempts, ongoing perseverance into my early 40s, we actually did conceive our second daughter, who is now 26. Prior to making Aliyah, I studied social work and worked in New York at the Jewish Home and Hospital for the Aged. Well, once I was back in the US, I became dedicated to supporting people who were experiencing loss, the grief of infertility and the grief of perinatal loss. I became the social worker for the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Bereavement Support Program at a large hospital on Long Island. As an inpatient social worker, I focused on providing support at the time of the loss and running bereavement support groups. I also worked to educate staff, doctors, nurses, clergy, intake personnel, and more about how to handle these situations and how to give support in all types of perinatal loss experiences. As what often happens in our world, my personal experiences informed the professional choices I made. I'm now the social work clinical supervisor of the Pregnancy Loss Support Program, PLSP. PLSP is a program that was started 40 years ago under the auspices of the National Council of Jewish Women, New York. The New York chapter is the largest and oldest chapter of National Council of Jewish Women. Nina Beth Carden, who is speaking next week at this Bikur Chulim conference, was the founder of PLSP in the early 1980s as part of the Jewish Women's Resource Center. The program has undergone many iterations since then, though its purpose is the same. People who've had a loss, supporting people who are now experiencing a loss. A critical part of finding meaning to one's loss can be gained by helping others going through it. I now turn the program back to Amy and Devorah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing your story. And I deeply appreciate the kind of setting the stage for this conversation with the human component of it, right? While we both are therapists and we both have our own stories to share or choose not to share with an audience, hearing the humanity of it first, and even to be able to listen to you tell the story in a way that almost, I might say, sounds clinical, right? That it's almost like this date and this many times and this many challenges. And what I would challenge each and every one of us to take a pause in this story and make it more about the humanity rather than just the story that was just told. And to know that every single time somebody goes for an IVF round, it's the prep, it's the anticipation, it's the hopefulness, it's the, did I do it right? Did I remember all the shots? Did it work? I am waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting. And then it fails and then it's unsuccessful. And then there's time passing and everybody keeps on moving forward. And you are left in this cycle of trying again and again and again. And if we notice within that story, right, it isn't just this many rounds and this many days and this many children that survive. There's so many pockets of that experience all in between that we haven't even talked about. And I just want to acknowledge that component of this experience where we tend to hear the details, but we're missing what's happening in the in-betweens, in the shadows of the actual story. And I think that our approach this evening is going to be hopefully a bit interactive. We are aware that there is a challenge with the link that was sent out today. It is very frustrating. I know for some of you had a hard time getting on, and hopefully others will navigate their way here creatively and find us. Again, it has been recorded and will be sent out to those that unfortunately might miss it because of that technical error. I guess so many years post-pandemic, we are still trying to figure out technology. There's no way around that reality of our lives. I want to start with you, Nancy, usually, and this will be interactive between Nancy and I, both of us being therapists. I am an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker, as well as is Nancy. And what I also have additional advanced training as a PMHC, a perinatal mental health clinician or certification that works within kind of the realm of perinatal pregnancy and postpartum experiences. So for me, that would be pregnancy law, let's put it this way, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, so the postpartum depression, perinatal depression, and all that goes along with that. And then I'm also a reproductive mental health specialist, and I work with deep certification and experience in the infertility world. And then pregnancy loss really kind of is that hybrid of the two, right? pregnancy loss exists very deeply in the infertility world, and pregnancy loss, of course, is going to anybody who attempts to get pregnant, is that 1 in 4 pregnancies will end in a loss. So we know that pregnancy is associated with loss, infertility is deeply associated with loss. And so there's that kind of crossover between my two clinical worlds or experience worlds. You talked a bit about this idea of a disenfranchised grief. So, when we take a step backwards and we look into what does grief look like in the general world, a general loss, maybe you might even say a normative loss, a loss where there is space for you to function within society within that loss. So to me, that means that it is an acknowledged loss. It is something where somebody knows about it, usually can figure out, hopefully, something appropriate to say. I'm so sorry for your loss, which may or may not be appropriate. We'll discuss that in a bit. Acknowledgement of, oh, how tragic it is that somebody lost their parent or their sibling, right, or the spouse. There's kind of a developmental norm to the experience of, if I am privileged enough to age, I will be privileged enough to have to mourn people that I love, right? There's no way around that. It is a developmental experience to grieve those that are older than me, hopefully only those that are older than me. But in a disenfranchised grief or in a perinatal death, there is a different experience in that it's almost an out of order experience. It is not the normal to have an experience where a parent grieves the loss of a child. Even to the degree that we don't even have a word. There are different organizations and different studies that have been done to try and identify a word for a bereaved parent who has buried a child. But there is limited experiences around the terminology or the orientation to a parent who loses a child. So some of you might even be saying, but if you're all here already, you probably will agree with me. Some of you might say, well, did you really lose a child? Did you really bury a baby? Is this really the same thing as somebody who loses, God forbid, a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or 25-year-old? Like, is it really the same thing? Just in giving consideration to this idea of, there was so Brené Brown talks about this idea of comparative suffering or the grief Olympics. And I like really both of them. Like, those really speak to me in terms of, I see it so often with the women that I work with, and especially in like the conference support calls that I run, it'll be about, well, mine was only a 7-week loss, and but mine wasn't as bad as the 39-week loss. And my baby lived for a day. It's not as bad as if the baby had lived for 2 years. Like, people like to create comparative suffering experiences. And it really, honestly, when I see it, it's typically, although not always, in an experience of like, oh, I don't want to compare. Like, I feel bad. Like, yours was much later and I feel bad mine was much earlier. Although I do see the opposite, where sometimes I'll have women or people who will say to me things like, well, I don't understand. Why is she here? She only had a 9-week loss and I had a 37-week stillbirth. So, it kind of can go both ways. But what we do know is that when there isn't a structure for this grief, because within the traditional Jewish tradition, like within the tradition as it has existed for many, many years, for thousands of years, there really wasn't a structure around perinatal death, and even to some degree about very, very early child loss. Even from a halachic perspective, there has been, it still is very much that way in many Jewish communities. There has been some movement in some Jewish communities toward ritual, towards much more understanding around the needs of couples and parents as they grieve their babies. But there definitely historically was not much around. There was definitely no Jewish ritual around it. And if you even look, I would say culturally and communally, there was not much in the non-Jewish world either, because I think that the infant mortality rate was significantly higher than what it is today. It was almost understood that you would lose children in childhood. We had cholera and measles, mumps, and rubella and strep and anything that today, we don't really think much, hopefully, about. But these things killed the babies. They killed mothers and they killed children too. So the infant mortality, the child mortality rate was different. I think there was almost an understanding that grief that a parent would not necessarily have the privilege of raising their children into adulthood. That doesn't mean it was easier. It doesn't mean that, well, they knew it was going to happen, so it was not that big of a deal. I guarantee you, I don't have to ask the mothers and the matriarchs and the patriarchs whether they were in pain at the losing of their children. And I think one of the things that I find to be one of the most profound pieces of our liturgy is the fact that on Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days of the year, the prayer that the Kohen Gadol, the highest priest, on the holiest day of the year, in the holiest room of the holiest of holies, prays that no woman should miscarry. This should be the year that no woman miscarries. Of all the things that he could pray for, that's what he chooses to pray for: health and happiness and parnasa. Nope, it's about that no woman should miscarry this year. And I think that just like underscores for me that while there may be no halachic historic ritual around it, it's been to be acknowledged by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur says to me, this is a pain that is lasting, and this is a pain that is very, very real. And so as we continue this conversation tonight about how do we cope with a disenfranchised grief, but also for some, it's considered an ambiguous loss. It's one that doesn't have as much framework and structure around it. If I didn't meet the baby, did it ever really exist? If I never felt the baby, was the baby ever real? These are some of those dances that we do in our brains and in our hearts. And our job as a community, and of course as therapists, but our job as a community is to be able to fully be present with people who are in pain and to navigate this experience with them in a way that is supportive. Nancy and I were kind of batting some words back and forth, and we both had these similar reactions to certain words that were just kind of like naturally being thrown around in conversation. So for example, when we talk about time does not heal all wounds, which was the title that I had offered for this presentation. Some of you might say, well, I mean, I've heard that so often. What do you mean time does not heal? But it does for other kind of wounds, doesn't it? And I think we're going to start with the time heals all wounds perspective, because it actually, I think, creates extraordinary confusion for people who are grieving, because there's this expectation that as time passes, it will no longer hurt so much, or I won't feel the loss, or somehow it will get better. And I think that what we need to do is create a new framework for what grief actually looks like over time. So before I jump into this as a conversation a bit with Nancy, one of the things that I think is important in terms of laying that framework down is many of you might be very familiar with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, right? She is the mother of grief work in many ways. And also many people are familiar with what we call the 5 stages of grief, right? However, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross really actually did not create 5 stages of grief. What she did was she studied the terminally ill and dying. The 5 stages that she talks about, and many of us have studied and learned and maybe even had to memorize for a test, actually apply to the person who's dying. It applies to the person who has a terminal illness that is confronted with end of life and is confronted with things like denial and anger and all the other things that I never actually memorized, and ultimately ending up at the acceptance point that they are going to die and that their life is ending. Somehow, I would say it wasn't necessarily even the professional world or the clinical world, but society kind of like grabbed those 5 stages and turned it into the 5 stages of grief. And it's such a disservice to the population, because there isn't 5 stages of grief. Maybe there's 200 stages of grief. Maybe there's no stages. Maybe it's just a lived experience that one has no choice but to navigate. And some days it will feel like A, and some days it will feel like B, and some days it will feel very numb, and some days I will be rageful, right? So to think that there are stages creates a lot of confusion, because my clients will say things like, okay, so I went through this stage and I for sure did the denial thing, and now I'm in the anger thing, but like I'm really ready to get to the acceptance part. And I have to like reteach, right? And unfortunately reorient them to what this really looks like. And instead of a stage or staging or even a linear process, grief is not linear. And it's no different for perinatal death than it is for any other kind of bereavement related loss. And so what we're looking at is, instead of a linear experience, I want you to imagine the most chaotic roller coaster you have ever been on. So it feels like, oh, it's leveling out. I feel a little bit more secure. I feel my foot, kind of breathe a little bit. And then all of a sudden the bottom drops out beneath you. And then you're upside down. And then all of a sudden you're righted again. And then all of a sudden you're upside down. And then you're flat. You're like, okay, I definitely can see that when I am kind of at a stable space. And then the bottom drops out, right? I had a conversation with a woman today who there had been a tragedy in her community. And she herself had experienced a birth trauma and almost lost her life. And when the tragedy happened in her community where somebody died, it immediately brought her back to that memory of, I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to be dying. And she said this was so many years ago that she had this birth trauma, and it immediately pulled her back, and she reached out for support. And it was interesting because of the city that she was in. I knew about the tragedy. And when I heard from her, I said, I know exactly why. I didn't know her story. I didn't know anything, but I knew that something had triggered this person in that experience. And I think that we will see that very frequently. But why do I bring that up? I bring it up because there is no way to navigate the world post-perinatal loss without the constant or frequent exposure to other people's simchas, to the celebrations of their lives, to other people's sadness and the losses of their lives, and to not create a connection. So for many of you on the call tonight, maybe you listened to Nancy's story and you said, oh, it sounds so familiar to me because it's similar to mine. Or you listen to that call and you listen to somebody else tell their story and it's so familiar to you on an emotional level, right? You can feel their pain in a way, which ultimately is the essence of empathy. But you can feel the pain of this lived experience because you yourself either experienced it yourself or somebody close to you experienced it. And so when we talk about perinatal death, or the death of a child, or the death of the loss of a pregnancy, and whatever terminology you choose to use, what we are acknowledging is that this is a loss that is one that needs to be honored, that needs to be respected, that needs to be seen as a loss that is worthy of grieving. And so when we talk about time heals all wounds, let's start with that one. And I have about 5 or 6 others, words that kind of get thrown around in the grief world or in the support world, in the compassion world, sometimes in the chaplaincy world, and sometimes in rabbinic and pastoral worlds, where they, kind of like to throw that line out there. I recently did a lecture for a group of up and coming rabbis, and one of the rabbis had a very difficult time when I said, that line of God doesn't give you anything that you can't handle. And he said, I don't understand. Like if somebody's looking to me for support, why can't I offer that to them? And what was really neat was that the head of the program, the head of the rabbinic program said, before you answer that question from a therapy perspective, he says, let me just tell you one thing. It is not sourced in Jewish history, but there's actually no source of that in Jewish liturgy, which I was like, I never even knew that. I guess it probably is Christian based. So that was just an interesting idea, that the idea of time, that the idea of God doesn't give you anything you can't handle really actually isn't sourced in our Torah. And that's something that is, it works for me. And I know it works for Nancy in terms of saying, okay, good. So we don't have to go there. We don't have to discuss that one, right? So let's go to time heals all wounds. Okay. I will get to the chat. I'm going to pull up things from the chat in a moment, right after Nancy and I kind of start this conversation. And I actually am going to ask you to share your perspective on what we're mentioning. I will ask you direct questions and I will ask you to get ready to type and be kind of contributing in that way to this conversation. So when I hear the words time heals all wounds, let's start off. If Nancy, if you don't mind, if you could respond first, what are some of the things when you hear time heals all wounds, what bothers you about that term?
Well, when I hear that, I realize the way I look at the grief experience is that first of all, everyone's perspective, everyone's experience is so individual, and their relation to and their own personal history, their own experience in relationships, and how they manage their own emotions. But time heals all wounds. When I look at a loss of someone grieving, what I like to say is this isn't something that there's certainly not linear and certainly not necessarily an end point. It's something that you integrate this into your life. Some of the pain at different points may recede, and sometimes it's going to be full blown, like you were talked about the chaotic roller coaster. And that's just part of accepting that this is the experience, this is your new life. It's something that has transformed you, but it may break you at times, but it will not, it doesn't mean that you can't continue, but your life is different. And it doesn't, and I don't like to think of it as the grief is healed or time will heal the wound. I don't see an end.
I'm going to come back to the healing one in a minute. I definitely want to come back to that word healing, right? So I think what you're also expressing is that idea of, I like to consider it as, what do I do with the time, right? So what I do with that time may provide me comfort. It may provide me support. It may provide validation. It may provide me connection. It may be something that I have a process that I need to go through in order to cope with what I've been given and what my challenge is at this time. I'm strongly avoiding that term healing. I actually never use the term healing. And I think that when I think about this experience, when I say, what am I doing with the time? So I like how you talked about that word recede, that the intensity may recede or retract. And I like to use the word soften. So again, you'll hear two therapists who have different ways of the language that we are using with. Sometimes grief may soften in terms of how you feel today versus how you'll feel in a year. But that doesn't mean that intensity won't shoot up and explode when faced with meeting a little boy that it would have been the same age as your child, or attending a bar mitzvah of your friend's children that you should have been having a bar mitzvah that year, right? Or even to the point of people's weddings, beginning to marry their children off and knowing that there could have been a child at that age that you would have been making a wedding. And so grief will spike and then soften and spike and soften. And I think that what we want to do when we talk about it is to take away a little bit of the shock part of that, the expectation of it, right? That I know that this is going to come and it will still catch you off guard. There's no way for me to know exactly what that trigger will be. I'll never forget. I mean, one of the things just recently happened. I remember when my child turned 10 and my youngest turned 10. And there was just, I totally didn't see this coming, but there was something around that age of 10 that felt very big. It wasn't about mitzvah. It was just, she turned 10 and it was like, she's no longer a single digit. She's a double digit child. And there was an awareness of, she's my baby and she will always be my baby. And I never had that next end of happy story. And I have what I have, and it just would catch me in my throat. And I remember thinking to myself, she's a bit older now, and I remember thinking to myself, oh, there it is, right there. There it is. I didn't see it showing up. I didn't see it coming. And then it would just catch me and it would get really tight in my throat. And I have wonderful friends, and I would call a friend or I'd call a sister. I would say, just let me tell you, like, I just need to cry for right now because it just shocks me when my child turned 10. And so nobody could have warned me and said, just warning you, when she turns double digits, it's going to be difficult. Like, that's not how this works. But that awareness that there will be times when, I just found out that a classmate of mine had a baby a few months ago. I'm mid-40s. Okay. She just had a baby. Now, part of me is going, I'm so glad that's not me. And then part of me is going, wow, you mean that really, like, that can still happen for people? And how fascinating it is, this shared experience and like allowing the space for the grief or the sadness or whatever shows up when those feelings explode. You could call it triggers. You could call it jealousy. You can call it whatever you like. Doesn't matter. There's no judgment in the language. But as time passes, those feelings do change. Sometimes it's harder feelings in certain ways as it becomes more real, that I can't believe this is the life that I have and this is what I'm coping with. And sometimes it softens. Sometimes it's big versus small. Sometimes I feel like it's in my pocket. Sometimes my pockets feel very heavy. Sometimes I can say to the person standing next to me, can you carry this with me so it's not so much on only my shoulders? That's what happens in time. The other thing I just want to mention before I move on to God, we'll go to the healing word next. The other thing that I think is important to notice is when people say, what am I supposed to be doing? How do I do this? And my answer is just do. It's the only thing you shouldn't be doing is not doing anything. And when I explain what that means is, I'm okay, I'm fine, don't talk to me, I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to grieve, I'm fine, I'm going to cook dinner, I'm going back to work, I'm okay, I'll have another baby, I'll be fine, right? Or it was early, or it was late, or I just, right? The not doing is the dangerous part. So what I do with time is something that creates that integration that Nancy talked about. And that really actually is the ultimate goal, is that I have no choice but to learn to live with what it is that is part of my story and to integrate that into who I am today. And some of you might be like, I don't want to. Like, I don't want this part of my story. This was horrible. This was painful. Like, this sucked. I really have no, like, I like that older person before me. Like Nancy was just saying, like, this is the new reality, but like, how many women have sat there going, well, I don't like it. Like, I liked who I was before. Thank you very much. Please do not make me try something new. Right. And instead we are forced to say, this is real. I have no choice. Right. There's a woman, a friend of mine who's very unwell, and she has to go to chemo every 2 weeks, probably forever. Like, there's no possibility of her no longer. Well, I mean, we can pray, and we have prayers, and we have miracles that happen, and maybe new amazing treatments that I can absolutely pray for. But the reality is right now, the course of treatment is every 2 weeks chemotherapy. And it's what's interesting to me is not beyond just the sadness and the difficulty of it, but it's also like, that's not what she wants to be doing with her life right now. She's in her 30s. Like, she doesn't want to be doing chemo. She wants to be planning vacations and planning birthday parties and taking care of her babies. And she has no choice. And that is actually what sits the hardest for me, is that even when we are faced with the heaviest of burdens, we don't get to put them down. But perhaps with the support of others around them, we can kind of hold that with them so they are surrounded by others. I just do want to take a moment. Actually, Amy, can I trouble you? If you don't mind, is there anything you'd like to highlight from the chat? Because I see there's quite a bit of commentary. Is there anything that you would like to highlight that has come up on the chat so that I don't have to scroll through all 25 comments?
I think there is Mark Jacobs talks about the wound may heal, but the scar and associated pain can persist and reappear at any time. And like any scar, impact our physical and psychological condition. And then Julianne, right after that, she says, I'm hearing these time scars, all wounds, and that some scars are mostly healed. Some need to be open to heal differently. Some will be harder. Some will integrate. Some people will turn them into art, but that the scar is always there. I think that I wanted you to comment on that.
I love that. And I like that as a visual, because I think, I have a family member who does this fascinating work out of, it's called Empower Inc. Again, put aside the halachic ramifications of this, but I'll speak about it anyways. A family member who is a double mastectomy breast cancer survivor. And she has an organization that they tattoo beautiful designs where her breasts would have been, to give a woman a sense of identity, of beauty. Again, put aside halacha on tattooing. But what I found, so that idea of owning the wound in some capacity, that wound, you can't do anything about the wound. The wound and the scar, the remnant, and frankly, for most people, they would say to you, if you told me that wound would disappear, I would say to you, please don't take it away from me. Because the wound represents my relationship with my child. The wound is my connect. I didn't get the chance to nourish and nurture and love in person and hold and coo and feed my baby. So what is left is actually this relationship that I didn't get to have. And so when I am in pain, in some ways, that pain actually connects me to my child. There are those that really have a very difficult time softening the pain, because they're afraid that they will lose the relationship and the connection to their baby. And they might even begin to forget. And the pain can begin to represent that. We would work with them in terms of reorienting to the love that they can create a connection to their child, and they will never forget that. But yes, I think that that wound is one you have earned. And I know that that might feel in conflict to some people. But to me, it does make sense. It does. Powerful comments. I'd like to move us forward towards the word healing. Okay. So I have this like really visceral reactions when somebody says healing, because I think that when we talk about healing, it means different things to different people. So maybe I'm going to ask you if you could throw it into the chat, and I'll take a look at the chat now. But what do you think of the term healing? Does it speak to you or does it not speak to you, and why? What do you think about the word healing? And maybe while people are participating, Nancy, what do you think about the word healing?
I have actually mixed feelings about the word healing. I think it's actually a lovely word. And I think because there's something that, when you're sick, you want to feel better, and that's healing. And so when you're feeling badly from a bad experience, you want to heal from it. So I think there is something comforting about healing. But at the same time, I think that healing can take on there can be different, it's not just different stages, it can have different forms. And like, as you said, it could show itself. Healing can be through some kind of creative outlet, or it could be by helping others, or you can make meaning from your loss, and that can be a form of healing. And I think that's a really powerful way. But I also want to say that I think it takes a long time to come to terms, not to terms, but because coming to terms has another kind of like a finality, and I don't want to use that, but coming to figure out what works for you, and how are you going to make meaning of this experience in your life. And it can be in so many different it had so many different lives. It can have so many different avenues, branches that.
Right. And what I'm hearing you saying also is that the definition of how you and I might define healing can be actually different for everybody. So I heard you define healing as meaning making, potentially, as one of the definitions. I want to read some of the answers or responses from the chat. I think healing does not mean erasing. Good. Makes life easier. Connotations of moving on or becoming more okay are the parts that I find hard. Too many opportunities to be using different definitions and ideas of modalities. It's too broad a word for grief and loss. Healing is always possible, even up to the very last breath, where not everyone can be cured. There can be some healing, but I think everyone heals or recovers in their own way. And one person's recovery will be very different from another. This is not forgetting. Healing for me is an opportunity to grow and embrace. There is risk in being healed because people think you're okay. I think that's a very big, loud one for us. Instead of healing as above, as above, my comment about understanding makes sense. Understanding how the grief impacts our lives, choices, relationships, etc. There is, absolutely. Healing is always, hold on one second. Sorry, I'm moving up instead of down by accident. Hold on. Healing can be a lifelong experience, and that is okay. Healing is a gerund. Ooh, who is my grabbing her gerund in many years, and I could definitely not telling you remember what it means, but don't tell my English teacher that. Healing is a gerund, an ongoing verb. It is a word that means integrating into one's life story and perspective. It does not mean acceptance, and certainly not cure. And what I love about that is that we're going to talk about that concept of acceptance in a moment. Thank you, Rabbi. The wound, rather than the scar, is always there. There's a dark cloud that is always present, but sometimes other emotions, thoughts can penetrate or be present almost simultaneously. Healing is so tied into the expectation of how it's understood. It carries the meaning of its being a process while also suggesting a final point. I love that. I love every one of these comments, and I'm going to stop there. I appreciate the deep, intensive, consideration that you're giving to this conversation. Thank you. So let's move to the acceptance word, right? Which is actually one of the stages of dying, if we're going to be accurate, not one of the stages of grief. Nancy, why do you struggle with the word acceptance? Or do you?
I struggle with it because I think it has an expectation. And I think that everyone is individual, and I don't think that anyone should be required to accept something that is so unjust, so unfair, so not the way our lives are supposed to be, not the way the world's supposed to be. But we don't have a choice. And so, as you said, Dvora, it's learning to, or what we both said, learning to integrate it, learning to live with it in a way that doesn't really make sense, but we need to make some sense in our lives. And that's the way I look at acceptance, but not as a finality. Right.
I heard from many of the couples that I've worked with that have had my compassionate bereavement training experience with the MISS Foundation, they would say, I will never accept that I lost my child. I just cannot. I will never accept that this happened. I accept that I have no choice but to choose to figure out how to live without my child. That I have no choice about, and that I accept that there is this new experience that I have no choice but to figure out. I can never accept that the world continues to turn, or that the world has a space for this level of loss. And I think that that's an important differentiation, because helping people in some capacity work towards acceptance might feel also like there's a dismissiveness to this, that we are somehow trying to get them to a place, right? Rather than them navigating this in their own way. But I think that there's no goals here. It's actually about the process much more than about the goal of acceptance or healing. But listening to the language that people use is incredibly powerful. And you may actually learn from others how they've figured out to navigate this kind of loss and mourning and bereavement in their life experience. I want to take a look here at some of the chat, because we have such wise people in it anyway. So how do you ever accept this loss? And when you want to try to have a child again, how can you forget that roller coaster of fear that something might go wrong again and make acceptance impossible? Okay. I struggled with acceptance until someone told me it doesn't mean we agree, rather that it happened or it is happening. A very accurate assessment of that. So I think, just kind of thinking about, can I almost like either redefine the word acceptance or come up with something else that works better for the people that we are talking to and working with, or just living in the presence of. And I think that's, one of our previous comments also was that risk of trying to get people to the place of being okay, right? That they want to be okay, but okay is going to look extremely different for each person. Maybe that would be a good one to kind of jump over to here as well. That idea of I have to be okay. I want to be okay. When will I be okay? And I think that, I will say to them, well, what would okay look like, right? Every person needs to define what okay really is. Does okay mean that I remember to shower today? That might mean that today I'm okay. Does okay mean that I'm not rageful at my spouse? That might be today. Does okay to be okay, or to I just want to be okay, or when will I be okay again? Right? Then that is something where each of us, again, I think what we're doing is redefining language and saying, what does be okay mean? That I'm prepared to try again, right? I'm okay enough to try again. I'm okay enough to take the risk. I'm okay enough to be hopeful. I'm okay enough to feel that I can see the sun and shine again. One of the things I hear from people is that idea of the color bled out of the world, and they lost their child. The world went gray. maybe they begin to see color some days. And maybe that's their day where they might define themselves. Today I'm okay. For this moment, I am okay. Right. And just because I dip or spike or am reactive doesn't mean I'm not okay. It just means that I had a dip or a spike or I'm reactive because I was triggered, because I'm facing the reality of this grief and loss experience. Right. What do you think of that word okay, Nancy? Being okay.
I also
When
think,
somebody says, I just want to be okay.
yeah, I think I really try to validate that you are okay, but this is how you are, and this is how you are today. Doesn't mean you'll be something else tomorrow, and that will also be okay, because your feelings are always going to be in flux, in pain, but you know, not always, but it'll all be.
It can show up.
It can show up, and that's being, you're still okay.
Right. Yeah, I think, sometimes okay really for me goes back to basic function. So I look at, somebody says, how will I know if I'm okay? And I actually talk about it as benchmarks, that if you normally would have showered every day, and a week after your loss, you showered twice, and the 3 weeks after your loss, you showered 3 times, and 4 weeks after your loss, you showered 3 times, that's okay. Meaning we're looking at moments or pockets of experiencing, almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That hierarchy of needs, that basic functioning. If in the beginning you couldn't eat, you were eating nothing, they force fed you some soup, right? And 3 to 5 or 6 weeks later, you find yourself eating some almonds or eating a fruit, or maybe even being curious about a piece of pizza. That's just showing you movement. And that's really actually what we're looking at, is the movement in your own lived experience. And you define what that looks like. Another one that I might look at is also in how they interact with others. So especially if they have other children at home, if most days you would used to make dinner 5 nights a week, I admire those women who do, right? 5 days a week, you make 6 days, 7 days a week, you make dinner. And then after your loss, you just weren't making dinner and other people were providing. And then 3 to 5, 6 weeks later, you started making dinner. Now making dinner might mean ordering pizza, and that's fine, or macaroni or peanut butter and jelly or bread and butter, that's fine. But you're making that where 3 to 5 weeks ago you weren't. That's, I am okay. That is where I'm moving. There's movement in my grief experience. It doesn't mean that in the anniversary of that loss, you won't be back to cooking, not at all, right? That you're like, we're done for this week. I'm done for sure. Let's take a look at some of the comments. Amy, do you want to read some of those comments about okay versus not okay?
I am absolutely these comments are sitting with me in this really beautiful and meaningful way. I love what Miriam said here. She said, I think there's a confusing distinction between okay and who I was.
Yeah.
I mean,
but we're going to talk about that idea of like returning to normal, right?
Exactly.
Who I was before.
I was going to say, I'm not going to steal your thunder. I knew you were going to speak about it. So, but that was really powerful for me. And this also what Wolf said here, for all the words we still have, we have in the English language, there are still too many meanings per word, right? Okay, not okay. What does that even mean? Who knows?
Right.
Yeah. And this wonderful response by Barbara, who says, people often say they are okay because it is the expected response. And the one asking the question isn't always in the position to listen, to support in the way that is really needed. And that's so very, very true. There's so many people out there who really think that they're ready, or that they feel that they're putting themselves in the position of being supportive, and yet they don't have the capacity to do so. And so, absolutely.
Right. I think also that idea of like, I mean, to me, that always comes back to the question of how are you, right? Like, how are you? I'm okay. Well, like, what option do I have? I'm really not okay. Last night I just thought about like, ending it all. Like there's realities in that, right? And we don't really give space when we say, how are you, to an actual response, right? And I think that that's one of those challenges, even with that the expectation is you're fine, because I don't really want to deal with all the stuff if you're not, right? Like I just don't have time for that or space for that. So let's move into that space of that return to normal. Like, I just want to be, like I said before, I liked who that person was before. I liked who I was before. I didn't want to change who I was. It was good. Like, and now here I am, and you're telling me that I have to create a new normal, and I have to come to terms with what I'm dealing with, and I have to face the reality of what I've, all this hard stuff. This is one of those spaces where there can be that like resistance of like, I don't want that. Like, I do not want that. And part of each person's reaction and experience is to navigate their way to the space of, I may not want that, but I have no choice. And there is a surrender in that. And none of us can help you get there faster, right? Or in a way that is, easier, other than to say you're not alone in this process. I think that's one of the things that I find the most powerful. There was a death of a child in our community a number of years, almost a year actually. February 28th is the anniversary of her death. And there happened to be a family of a soldier who was murdered, who was coming through the community. I think there was a fundraising event in Center City in Philadelphia, and he heard that this family was sitting Shiva, and he asked, they were a few days post Shiva, and he asked to meet with the family. And he said, I want to sit and talk to them because he was the brother of the soldier that had been killed. And he said, I would just want to talk to them. And it was such a powerful expression of support, where it would be the only person, I think, that would be appropriate to sit with somebody in such a shocking and tragic loss. Where I remember I got a phone call once years and years ago. It must be 20 something years ago. And there was a young man in the community where we lived who didn't wake up. And I got a phone call 3 days later by somebody else in we were in Florida, they were in Baltimore. She said, Devorah, I need you to get me the phone number for the mother who just lost a child. And I want to make a phone call to her because she's part of this new horrible club that we are a part of. And there's others who have walked this path before her, and we will help her walk that path. And it was just a profound outreach from across the globe, I mean, literally across the country, and last year across the globe, where this Israeli man sought out an opportunity to support a brother in need and his family. That we don't have that privilege of return. There's no opportunity to return to normal. There isn't. There's no way to go back to who I was before. And there will be those that will find that concept of making meaning or of the post-traumatic growth experience. And yet I caution you deeply and strongly that there are those that do, and there are those that don't. And it isn't that one did it right, and one didn't do it correctly. We do not talk about post-traumatic. I do not talk about post-traumatic growth with my clients. I do not talk about post-traumatic healing with my clients. They may find that in their own way, and I actually will caution them from jumping too far ahead into that space. So I'll be working with somebody, and let's say I think we're going to dedicate a day of learning, and we're going to start a new project, we're going to do a new initiative, we're going to fund this, and we're going to do a day at the JRA. And I'll be like, hang on one second, hang tight. Like, you're jumping, because it gives you like something to touch and to tangibly work with when you're in such chaos. And actually, that's not going to work in your favor. Actually, it's about taking a step back and sitting in the Shiva, whether there is or there isn't a Shiva to be sat in. That concept of, we have such richness in our Chazal, in our historical gifts from our rabbis, of just sit, do not get up, do not move. And it's one of the greatest difficulties with perinatal loss, is we don't necessarily have access to that for those that choose to follow the historical way of doing things. It's like, don't necessarily have that Shiva. And yet that Shiva is such wisdom in that ability to just sit, do not move, do not get up, do not retreat, do not isolate. You have no choice but to be among your people, and we will hold this with you. One of the more profound visuals that I've had recently, and actually took place at the funeral of that girl that passed away, Liana, this visual of her parents walking through the double row after they had buried her, and the whole hundreds of people were there, and they stood on either side of the walkway, and they walked between the community. And if you think about that concept of Imo Anochi B'tzara, I am with you in your pain, that sometimes that's all we can offer, is I will stand beside you. It was such a profound visual that spoke to the psychological concept of, I will stand beside you in your pain. I cannot heal you. I cannot comfort you. I cannot get you back to normal. I cannot make you okay. but I can stand beside you. And our rabbinic history, our legacy is that concept exists in our tradition. I will literally stand on either side of you as you walk back into your lives without your child. And I just think about how do we allow for that concept, as we're discussing in these evenings of awareness and education, are doing just that, of saying, I will stand beside you, and I will bear witness to this pain that I cannot take away. I've never heard so many men wailing than at that funeral. Never. I'd never heard that many tears from the men in the room. There's something so profound about that experience. And yet doing these things when there may not be a shiva and there may be a less of a structure of for support, that doing these kind of evenings, I think, offers some of that space. I'd like us to move a little bit further along, and then I want to actually take us to one last one. And then I'm going to hand it over actually to Nancy to give us some information and share some of the wisdom of the work that she does. I want to talk about closure, right? I think for both of us, we're like, we do not use that word closure. Nancy, what is it about that word closure that bugs you just like it bugs me?
Well, just like we said before, there is no end game, and that's what closure kind of connotes. And I think we have to be careful, because I don't look at it as closure. I look at it as the term I used before is integration. And I don't look at as anyone ever returning to normal, but there's a new normal, you've become a new person. You've been transformed by this profound experience that no one ever expected to go through. And we do expect that if we, God willing, we live a long life, that we will, we know that we'll lose our parents, but we don't expect to lose our children. And it just, so to integrate that, and so there's no formal closure. There's a way of us becoming the people who we become based on our experience, and finding, and when we talk about making meaning, it's not necessarily doing something tangible. It's who we become as people that can be what makes meaning for us. Not it doesn't have to be a specific task. It doesn't have to be a project. It's just who we become has meaning in that.
Yeah. I think about the word closure. I think there's very rare circumstances where I think it's appropriate. I think about the tragedy of parents that do not have a body to bury, where the child goes missing or the body hasn't been returned from war. To me, there is no question that there is a technical component of closure that is valuable and necessary to be able to bury. And I think that is a powerful, so I think the word closure can apply very appropriately in those kinds of circumstances. Sometimes closure might be offered in a way of like, I know why this happened. So it gave me, I had knowledge there was an infection, there was a genetic abnormality. So there is closure in knowing the full story, but grief doesn't offer that. Grief doesn't really offer us that space of closure. And if we continue to seek it, we will continue to be running after something that is not available to us. And it is going to distract us from the processes that are available and that are supportive and that are connecting to either those that have gone through this before who can help guide us, or just in terms of our own movement through this experience in whatever that looks like. So let's take a look at, I'd love to hear some of the comments, and I appreciate each of you that take the time to write such profound things. Closure for each person is different. I was with my daughter after she lost her pregnancy. We walked past the synagogue and she pointed at the Geniza. Later, she told me she needed to get rid of the ultrasound photos and she wanted to put them in the Geniza because she could not throw them out. I took a few photos back to the US with me, and she had closure by burying her photos in the Geniza. Again, a profound choice that somebody might make. It would not be my recommendation necessarily to need to get rid of, but I think that there are those that will say, I need to put it somewhere. And I think about that as the preciousness of being able to put it in a place that has meaning and holiness for you. To be able to even, there was a magnificent, again, I hate to bring up, fake stories, but I'll do it anyways. There was a beautiful episodes in Call the Midwife, where one of the young women lost a baby died at birth, and it was a stillbirth. And there was a conversation of what to do with the body. And she was offered this opportunity of an elderly woman in the community had died. And she was asked, the family was asked, would you allow the baby to be buried with her? And there definitely is historical tradition to that as well. And that idea of like, can I find place for my story in some way, either the physical body to be buried, or there's, parts of this original story, and placing them in a way that offers me the space for either the space for process. Again, not healing, not moving forward, not moving on, but just to be able to say, this feels meaningful to me. I very often will encourage people to create a box, a pretty box. And in that box go your photos and we all keep our positive pregnancy tests. The P6 can go in there. Why do we save them? Like the card that you get from the OBGYN's office that you have an appointment in a few weeks, right? Things that hold memory in some capacity, especially if there isn't something that you get to hold at the end of this pregnancy. Some have that opportunity, some do not. And so to have some place to go, to churn, to talk about, to think about, to touch, something that holds this memory with you can be very valuable, but not everybody has that. And so just thinking about that idea of closure is really this thing that isn't necessarily available for people, nor is it necessarily something that we should be working or seeking toward, because it really doesn't hold value. Because I think that when we open up the space rather than closing the space, we have more opportunity for living and for connection, for reducing isolation, and for ultimately, as you described, Nancy, making meaning, finding this new identity, whether I want to or not, and then ultimately finding integration, that this becomes part of who I am and who I am becoming. And perhaps even, as you're going to describe, a way for me to potentially even support others as they experience this process and this grief. So Nancy, why don't you take it from here? We can then come back to a couple of questions before we finish out our evening at 9:30. Why don't you talk about your peer support program that you've been involved with?
Sure. Let me see if I am.
Nancy, I just gave you hosting ability so you can share.
Okay, so I am going to if I put up this, can you see this? Does that show up?
Make sure it's open on the screen behind you, and then open the Zoom to share it. First, open the PowerPoint.
Okay, and then
click on the Zoom on the bottom of your screen. There should be like a Zoom button probably to bring the photo of yourself and me back up again.
Okay, is that working?
Now hit share. Try now. Did you hit share again? Share screen on the bottom.
Share screen. Thank you. No, is it showing up?
Not yet. You have to choose the item that you want to share. Your PowerPoint should be in one of the boxes.
I want to welcome everyone to your tech lesson for the evening. Thank you, Deborah, jack of all trades.
I've been teaching on Zoom for 4 years, but I still don't seem like I've been successful. Have you? It's not there?
No, I'm not finding it. Okay. So I'm going to it's okay. I'll just tell you a little bit about the pregnancy loss support program, which is, as I described in the beginning, from the National Council of Jewish Women of New York. And the program is designed to we give support. The people who give support are peer counselors who themselves have had losses. Their losses, and I would say at least a good 50% of our peer counselors are those who had losses 20 to 30 years ago, but they had received support from our program, and then they went on to lead their lives, to recover from their losses, to have families, have subsequent positive outcomes, or build families and build lives and have careers. And then they remembered and they wanted to come back and help, and so and give support to others. And we don't expect anyone to be able to give support a year or two after their loss. We have our peer counselors are people who have integrated their losses, and then they find a way that they want to honor their loss, honor their baby, and give support to people who are presently grieving. And it's a very and that's why it's a continuum of healing, or because the healing never ends. And it's a very special part of how our program works. And all the work is done. It's free. The telephone counseling is done throughout the country, and people get support by from the peer counselors. Everyone is connected by we have an intake worker who connects people one-on-one to someone who's had a similar loss, and they get 3 telephone counseling sessions. And then we have support groups that work 6 session support groups. Also, there's and now with Zoom, the groups run virtually, and it's a very powerful, as those of you who've ever participated in a support group, it's a very, very powerful experience to be with others who are going through exactly the same really the same thing. And we've separated now later term losses from early term losses. And that we used to not, and we found that because we really honored everyone's loss was just as meaningful. But we found that people who had early term losses had a harder time being in the presence of those who had later term losses and stillbirths, and for them to think about a subsequent pregnancy and what could happen for them, they weren't comfortable. So at their request, we separated those support groups, and now we have first trimester support group and then later term losses. And it just I really just want to say it isn't for everyone. It isn't for everyone to even participate in a support group, and it isn't for everyone to become a peer counselor, but it is what people have found. And the one slide that I really would have liked to read, and maybe I'll go out so that I can read it to you, is some of our volunteer experiences, how they feel that they are feeling that the experience of being connected to their baby, to their loss, and honoring their loss by and it's like I said, it's a continuum for them for the for way into their later years. So I see a question here. How does it help the healing process for someone to be a counselor? It helps people by knowing that they're helping someone else, and that they can identify, and the person who is, and it gives hope. It gives hope to the counselee that they can get through this because they are talking to someone who has gotten through it themselves. And that's a very powerful experience that the counselees report, that the relief that they feel that they can connect with someone and they can see themselves in that person who is 10 years, 15 years out. And it just becomes a very meaningful.
Thank you, Nancy. Why don't we open it up for questions? If you'd like, you can put it in the chat, your question. Amy, do we want people to be able to, I don't know if they're able to unmute and ask a question, up to you.
Absolutely. People can definitely do that. I'd actually like to throw out a question for you, which I feel like is a little bit of the elephant in the room here. We're talking all about grief. We're talking about the different stages of moving through grief. What happens though? I mean, we still have the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the pillar of what people think about grief. And often there are the people surrounding us who don't understand these different phases, and that is really not an appropriate way to think about perinatal loss, and that grief can go on for a very, very long time. And Nancy's program is proof of that, of these women, multiple years later who will come back and want to do something with their grief and help. So the question I have for you is, what do you say to these family members, these community members, these people in your life who tell you, why are you grieving so long? How come you're not over it yet? What's wrong with you? Like, leave it alone already. It's too long. It's too much.
I'm happy to start with that one. I think it's, first and foremost, it's like, you don't have to answer everybody's question. And I think that, like, coming to a space of hopefully finding people that speak the language you need them to speak to you with, that is actually, I think what you will see, this is an idea of like cocooning, where the world becomes a little bit smaller and a little bit more, you become a little bit more reclusive and you lose a lot of your friends. Like, that doesn't sound very happy and fun, right? But you're like, wait, but I like the people in my life most of the time. But the people that will be around you who will get it are the ones that will sustain you through this experience. There will be people in your life who will just not get it. Now, you have options, okay? You can say to them, thank you for your concerns, and move along. You could say, I think you need some education around what grief really looks like in perinatal loss, or you can exclude them from your life for as long as you need to exclude them from your life. But, it's kind of hard to do that when it's your mom, right? Or your mother-in-law. So I would suggest that you pick and choose who you choose to respond to and who really deserves an answer. Thank you for your opinion is also an answer. Thank you thank you for your thoughts, right? Thank you for your opinion, right? How often those of us that have obnoxious teenage children, right, they give us their opinion and then we say, thank you for your opinion. Mommy and daddy will talk about it, right? Like, we will discuss it. I appreciate what you're telling me, but I haven't made a decision on whatever it might be, right? Or I'm still saying no, right? We can learn the art of doing that.
Can you print out a Kirkland label?
You want to cut that one? Thank you. That it's something where, can you identify the people who get it, who can say to you, I used to say, I have a dear friend that my mother was not well, Baruch Hashem, she's well today. It is, I remember calling a friend and all she said to me was, oh, honey, oh, honey, oh, honey, oh, honey, I'm coming over. I said, no, I'm okay. I don't know. I'm coming over. And the people who asked questions and asked opinion and offered opinions and offered those trite, like, oh, Mitzvah Shem, she'll be fine, God willing, and she'll be good, and you'll get good treatment. And where's she going to be? And who's she a doctor? Do you need a second opinion? Those were not my people. The oh, honey was the one that really understood in that moment. And she herself has gone through a lot of loss. And so for her, she knew in those moments, what we need are the oh, honeys. We need, and I see Ariella is on here as well, Ariella from Sviva. I spoke moons and moons ago at the foundation of Sviva, I think she's one of our corporate sponsors or participants. We spoke about this idea. You have to find your honeys. You have to find the person who will say to you exactly what you need. And the others, it's just chatter. Like, you're not obligated to respond, even if you feel obligated to respond. Because reality is, there is no moving on and forgetting and putting it behind you and just be happy. It's not real. And it undermines so much what people are experiencing. Nancy, what do you think?
I just wanted to say, I think it's really important to protect yourself.
Yeah.
And to create that boundary. And like you said, Devorah, it's just not going to be, and that you become really the most important person. And you have to find the words, and maybe someone can help you come up with the words, but that's really what we want to give the bereaved, the grief, that permission to find a way to protect themselves so that their needs are met. And that it could be for a lifetime, or it could be for, but connecting with people who are saying to them, why aren't you over it? Then they maybe some of them are saying it to their faces, maybe they're not, but it's felt. And you just want to find a way to create a safe space.
Devorah, being that we had some technical difficulties and we also started a few minutes late, we're opening this up for questions. We are supposed to end technically at 9:30, but we're going to extend it out a few more minutes after that. If people have questions, we want to make sure to give people airtime. So if anybody has a question that they want to unmute and ask Devorah or Nancy, please feel free to do so.
We've stunned them all into silence.
Right, Devorah, in terms of our usual practices of bereavement, which do you suggest for the couple? I mean, should they do shmira? Should they do tahara and shmira? Should they sit shiva? Should they, put a stone? I mean, do you have suggestions about those things?
So I think that's really out of my purview. I think that each person needs to find their spiritual advisor and the rabbinical guidance, or whoever it is that guides them in matters of Jewish law and Jewish ritual, and follow the guidance that they've been given in that capacity. I think that we can create our own private memorializing experiences in the privacy of our own home. One of the recommendations I will give is, especially when it comes upon the anniversary of a loss, is if there isn't an externalized ritual, one of the things I'd like, for example, would say, I'd like for you guys to, husband and wife, let's say, if there's a partnership, that I'd love for you to take the morning off of work and can you go spend some time together? I don't care if you go out and buy each other ice cream, but or take a walk or go to a lake or sit by a river. Can you go and just be together on this day, that this day matters and that this day is important? That's ritual, right? If it's, I intend to sponsor a day of study, nobody has to know even who or why you sponsored that day of study, but that might be meaningful to you. So finding your own pathway forward, not having structured ritual actually gives you some opportunity. And I would suggest that you seek guidance and support from those that can kind of work with you within the framework of what you're comfortable ritually and rabbinically. But making sure to note the day, the week, the month. I have it written in my phone. The women that I've worked with, the couples that I've worked with, every year I do, even if they're no longer my clients, I will text them a few days before. I know this is a hard week. I've been thinking of you. I'm holding the memories of your baby with me in my heart, whatever is relevant to that couple. And what's so profound is how many women will say to me, typically I'm working with the women, they'll say to me, you're the one who remembered. Not one person in my life remembered, not my mother, not my sisters. They all oh, because she had another baby, so she's fine now. She's like, I'm so grateful, and I don't mind being honest about the fact that I didn't just remember. Sometimes I give them a minute where they think I had the best memory ever. But other than that, I'm yeah, because it's important enough for me to remember. But I remember who I'm sending the message to. I remember the name of your child that I'm sending the message to. It mattered to me and it mattered to you. And I have never been faced with somebody saying to me, why did you remind me? They remember Elizabeth Edwards, that she was the one I learned this from. I'll give her credit. She said, don't tell me, if you want to talk about my son when she lost a child in a car accident. She said, you think I've forgotten him? When you talk about him, it means that you remember him too. And it means everything to me. I was just dancing at a wedding and an older gentleman got married, at least 40, right? And it was such a joyful space. And I saw the mother of a young woman who passed away. And she died in her mid-20s, and she would have been close to this boy's age. They were friends. And I just held her, and she was sobbing. And she was in the dancing. She was emotional. I just grabbed her, and I said, I remember Lauren. Lauren would have loved to have danced here, too. Of course, she was remembering Lauren. Of course, Lauren was part of that circle in her heart. And so to say her name out loud offered her that space. Some of these moments, we don't have names. Some of our babies were not named. Some of our babies are in memory without the name. And so say your child, your son, your daughter, that holds power. And don't hide behind the fear of saying nothing and say nothing. Step into it. What's the worst thing that could happen? You trip over your words, it's awkward, and they say thank you and you move on. It's okay. We can take some risks in our life. I'd rather risk it in that way and just be that person than not risk it at all and be that person who doesn't say it.
I'm just going to add to that for a second. I want to also, in terms of risk, so there's also this idea, we always say, be that person, exactly as Devorah said, reach out. It's better to reach out than to not reach out. There also sometimes when you reach out, sometimes things land in a way that you didn't expect, that maybe it's not the right thing to say right at that moment. Someone might be in a more fragile state, and you can see that what you said really did not land well. And I want to just take notice of that right here and say to all of you that it is okay to apologize. It is okay to say, I'm so sorry that I triggered you, that I made you upset. That wasn't my intention at all. I love you and I just want to be here and I want to support you. And I made a mistake and I can see that I made you upset. I think there's a real power in acknowledging that you may have accidentally done something that may have been off-putting, and to just own that and then to move forward with the relationship, as opposed to ignoring it, being embarrassed and not saying anything, and then feeling awkward in your next interactions with that person. These acknowledging the fact that you might have done something that's a bit off is also really important, because we all can't be perfect in grief. None of us are like Devorah, and I'm counting myself here. None of us are like Devorah and know exactly what to say at all times. So just owning the fact that we're all human, I think, is an important piece.
Go ask my sisters and my kids, and if I know what to say at all times. Of course I don't. I'm human too. I want to address two pieces of this, two angles to this. One I think you'll like, and the other one some of you are going to challenge me on, and that's okay because I'll take that risk. One is, I heard from a woman who it was a woman on a support call, and again, I never want anybody to recommend this to somebody else, but I just want you to give you a perspective. She said that when sometimes she gets really harsh words from others, or insensitive words, or the comments, or like, oh, I thought you were okay, like I thought you were whatever, right? Over it, better, okay, not so sad, right? She says, I take those words because I know they mean well. They mean to say something appropriate, like, okay, but like hopefully you get pregnant again quickly and then you'll be fine. So she said, I take those words and I jumble them up in my head and I put them in order into a new sentence that provides me comfort, because their goal was to be comforting. And so I just take those words, jumble them up in my head, put them into a new order, and then I take comfort from those words. Now, I think in Hebrew, the word is godless. I think that is greatness beyond greatness. I took my breath away when I heard it. Please do not recommend anybody else try it. I just want you to hear a profound way that someone has figured out how to navigate. And this was a woman that had loss after loss after loss. Now I'm going to give you another perspective. This is one you might not like that much. I do sometimes speak to the communities that are struggling and talk about being graceful and gracious, even in the face of the difficult pain that you are in. Most people don't want to hurt you. Most people have no idea how to support you. And most people would love to be that person for you and have no idea how. And it actually is a responsibility from those that are in struggle to act with grace. I know that person didn't mean to hurt me. I wish that person would leave me alone, but to not agitate in the anger to all of those that have not supported me the way that I needed support. That does not mean I should not speak up. That does not mean I should not advocate. It does not mean that I should not say, excuse me, that was hurtful, all of the above. But I think there's space for both, to act with grace and to act graciously to those that don't know how to do this well. And some of us might say, like, well, they should learn, and they should, I agree. But at the end of the day, I live with me. And how I react to those individuals, I have to go to bed with me at night. And I think that bodes well to living in my values, because I have seen people become extremely angry with the world and shut a lot of people out who really didn't need to be shut out, and to shut down the world. So I want to actually respond to Ariella's comment in the chat about, have we gotten better? I do think we've gotten better. I do. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this was not a conversation. And I think that we have seen extraordinary movement in the conversation. I think there's always room for growth, because there's still the next generation that's going to come up, and the next, I would be like, wait, I've spoken about this before. Everybody knows this already. You're like, oh, right. There's still some people who you haven't spoken to, right? There's still the next generation that will need to learn, because until the point where a woman will know, as the Kohen Gadol wishes, right? That at the point where no woman will miscarry, only then can we stop having these conversations with the next and the next and the next generation. But for today, this is something where we will continue to teach, and we will continue to grow, and we will continue to challenge each other in how to be good supporters. And then those that are in pain and suffering will hopefully find what they need, either from inside themselves, from others, those that will hold it with them. There's always work to be done. Ariella, there's always work to be done.
There's some more comments here.
Sure.
That I just want to read. Adina says, if you know someone who's had a perinatal loss, say something, see something, say something. I know, I'd love to hear your words of comfort, and I assume I'm not alone. And I think this goes for all loss, all tragedy, all illness. If you know someone is struggling, say something. Don't ignore them. Don't cross the street and pretend that you didn't see them. Don't not make that phone call. If it's harder for you to do it in person, if it's harder for you to make the phone call, send a text, send an email, but acknowledge it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And please make statements. Don't ask questions. I'm thinking about you. I care about you. You've been on my mind. I've been at my, you don't even have to say prayers. You don't have to say I'm praying for you. Please, I would actually advise against it. Just that you're in my thoughts, you're on my heart. My heart hurts with yours. I've been thinking about you. I honor, I acknowledge what you've been through. Just come up, be creative, right? My kids will say, Ma, you're so therapist-y. Okay, so what? So in my text messages, I'm therapist-y. So we can all be therapist-y a little bit. It's okay. It's better than not saying one word. I remember I once said to somebody, I just had a miscarriage. And she looked at me, she goes, oh, and I went, sure what I'm supposed to do with that, but okay, thanks. Like, not one word beyond that. And then the one that I did speak to, who said to me, oh, stop being, I said, I'm grateful. At least I got pregnant. So she goes, oh, stop being so grateful and start grieving. She goes, there's time for gratefulness later. And that was, to me, my favorite line. I use it all the time because she got it. She knew she'd had so much of her own experience, right? Stop being so grateful and start grieving. You'll do grateful later. That's what I needed. So, or the other one who I spoke to, who said to me, come, let me give you a cup of tea. Come sit down on my couch. Like, how magnificent. So there are those that do it well, and there are those that could do it better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. I'd like to really close out here tonight, and Devorah, to thank you and to thank Nancy for your incredible words this evening. It has been an absolute pleasure. I think I can say for all of us here that we have all gained a tremendous amount from your words and from your advice and from your teachings and from your lived experiences. We are going to, just for those of you who were not with us in our first program, we are going to stay on after this program officially ends, which will be in one more minute. We are going to stay on for another 30 minutes or so, just to have an open space for processing, for holding space for anyone who wants to discuss any of these issues. There are some things in the chat that we weren't able to get to. Maybe people want to talk about it. Rabbi David Balto, myself, and Liel Sugar, who is social worker at I Was Supposed to Have a Baby. I'm not sure if Devorah, I think Devorah cannot stay on. Correct. Yeah. Nancy said she was going to try, so we'll see if she can. But whomever wants to stay and process with us, we are here for the next half an hour. But in closing, Rabbi David, Rabbi Balto, please take us out.
Yes, well, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation and all the conversations. Let me just remind people that next week, next Wednesday, we have Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin, who wrote the book Tears of Sorrow and Seeds of Hope, which is like the only book on, rituals for people suffering perinatal loss, Jewish rituals, and also Rabbi Janet Madden. And one of the things we're going to do after all this is done is create a compendium of all those resources. But it's really worth going and listening to two people who also do counseling about how to make meaning out of rituals. By the way, one of the topics that Devorah touched on was closure. And at our National Bikur Cholim conference, which starts in the middle of March, we're going to begin, and it will run till June. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. Pauline Boss, who has written, who created the term ambiguous loss, and has written a book, The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in the Time of Pandemic. So, that will really be a nice complement to the subjects that Devorah and Nancy have brought up, and I hope you're able to join us. So hope we get to see you folks next Wednesday for the approach to rituals and loss.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for letting me be part of this evening. And Amy, continue to do this strong and important work that you're doing. David, thank you for always being a champion of this. Nancy, it's been a pleasure sharing the forum with you. Good night, everybody. You're welcome to find me. If you spell my name correctly, you'll find my email, my website, and then therefore my email. That is the correct way to spell my name, not on the flyer. No E, correct. No H, no apostrophe. So I hope to hear from you if you'd like any further guidance, support, whatever. I'm always happy to hear from people. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, Devorah, so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So as we close here, I just want to remind everyone about our all of our sponsors and our supporting organizations. We thank them tremendously for their work here, and both in this space and also lending their voice to this very important summit. And as final closing, thank you so much for being here. And if anyone wants to stay on and process, we are happy to do so.